of Gender. Thank you. The Office of Gender Equity in Science and Medicine is delighted to sponsor today's Amplifying Equity lecture. Sorry, I'm having a little bit of a glitch, but we'll get going. It'll work. It'll be fine in just a moment. So, today's lecture is sponsored by the Office of Gender Equity in Science and Medicine, as I said, and I want to thank Devin Madden, who's our Assistant Director of the Office, for handling all the technical aspects of today's sessions, including the recording and excluding when I mess up. So that's my own responsibility. And oh golly, this is unusual.
We have your back, Sandy. Do you need me to?
No, I'll be fine. I'll be
Okay.
fine. So now let me introduce myself. Besides being a klutz at the computer, I'm Sandy Mazer, and I'm professor of ophthalmology and pharmacological sciences, also the director of our Office of Women's Careers, which is within the Office for Gender Equity. A couple of housekeeping comments. Today's session will be recorded for those who have registered for the session, and previous Amplifying Equity lectures, which have been really wonderful and are rich sources of information. They're available on our Office of Gender Equity website. During today's talk, please feel free to put your questions in the chat. I'll be happy to ask them for you, or Dr. Johnson will respond directly, and we will also open up at the end for live questions at the end of the talk. So now I am delighted to introduce today's speaker, W. Brad Johnson, PhD, who is professor of psychology in the Department of Leadership, Ethics, and Law at the United States Naval Academy. He's also a faculty associate in the Graduate School of Education at Johns Hopkins University. A clinical psychologist, Dr. Johnson is a mentoring expert. He specializes in developing gender-inclusive mentoring cultures for organizations around the globe. He's the author of numerous publications, including 14 books, and they focus on the area of mentoring, professional ethics, and gender inclusion. I love the titles. One of them is Good Guys, How Men Can Become Better Allies for Women in the Workplace. And another one, which we can all buy for Christmas, is The Elements of Mentoring. The title of his talk today is Leveraging Mentoring and Allyship for Gender Equity in Medicine. I'm delighted to welcome you, Dr. Johnson. The stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mazer. I appreciate that. And I'm going to get my slides going here. What a delight to join the Sinai community. Thanks for, again, including me. I want to just kind of give you a little bit of context starting out. It may be a little odd that I'm an older white guy talking about this gender equity topic. And I just want to let you know I'm not going to mansplain for the next 45 minutes what women need in the workplace. I'll give you a little context for the research that my colleague and I have been working on for about a decade now. Our research involves actually going out and interviewing women, not including women in medicine, but women across professions and industries, and asking them very behavioral questions about their experience with men in the workplace. And what we're really curious about is, what does it look like to you as somebody who identifies as a woman when a male really shows up as someone you would identify as a colleague, as an ally, as a mentor sponsor? What does that look like? And we try and aggregate all of this, and we want to give it away to men in terms of how we can be better. I want to start with just a comment about the business case for gender equity. And I'm sorry that we even have to talk about this, but unfortunately for some leaders, and I'm talking about men especially, the business case matters. What I will tell you about the aggregate research at this point is there really isn't even a question. When we get more gender equity, not just at the baseline low levels of a profession, but all the way up into the C-suite, we simply do better. We make better decisions. We're more creative. We have better outcomes in your world, better patient outcomes, but we also have better financial bottom line outcomes when we have gender diverse leadership teams. We have to recognize that often men look at this and say, hey, there are women here. I see them. There's a woman down the hall. So we've solved this, right? We've solved gender equity. And what they're not really paying attention to is the evidence about how we're doing beyond medical school. So if we just look at healthcare, how are we doing? Well, we're pretty good at the entry level, 50-50. In fact, the majority of med students now are women, but you see that drops off very, very quickly as we start moving into more senior levels of leadership. So we call this a leaky pipeline in most industries. It's especially bad in medicine. And, you might ask, well, what's contributing to this? A lot of things, including bias and other kinds of headwinds women encounter. But I think there's another thing that I would like to touch on for my time with you today, and that's really access to relationships. Here's a study looking at mentoring and gender disparity across different subspecialties in medicine, and you just find it's ubiquitous. Women have, by and large, less access to developmental relationships, and even when they get access to them, maybe mentoring, they often don't come with a sponsoring component, meaning people aren't pushing them forward for next advancement opportunities. So clearly, we have work to do in this area. If you're wondering why my colleague and I spend so much of our time talking to men about this, and I think women can wonder about this as well. We're talking about gender equity. Why are you so focused on men? There are a number of reasons, but let's just look at one huge study from Boston Consulting a couple of years ago, going out across lots of different organizations and asking thousands of women, is your organization making real progress on gender diversity and inclusion? What you find, the strongest predictor of whether women say yes or no to that is whether they see their male colleagues engaging actively in championing gender diversity. When that's the case, 96% of women said, yep, I see the progress, we're moving ahead, versus only 30% if men just seem disengaged around this issue. So men have got to be in the conversation, and this is doubly so because, as you just saw on the leaky pipeline slide, most people in leadership are men. Most people making decisions happen to be men. So we have got to be involved here. If you ask men, most men in surveys say, I believe in gender equity. I really do. I believe in that. But when you look at their micro behaviors in the workplace, you find that simply believing in something doesn't translate into gender equitable behavior. Here's a big study by Integrating Women Leaders just last year, asking both men and women in organizations, are men doing these things day to day in the organization? And what you see is a huge delta between men and women in the way they rate men's behaviors. Men, by and large, are saying, oh, yeah, I see this all the time. We men are showing up as allies. Women are shaking their heads saying, I don't know where you work, buddy, but it's not here because I'm not seeing this behavior on the part of men. So one of our problems, of course, is overestimating how much we're actually doing simply because we believe in this. When my colleague and I started researching this back in 2015, we encountered so many reasons why men are reluctant to engage with women in the workplace. And, they include a lot of things you can imagine. Anxiety, I'm afraid of stepping in it, saying the wrong thing, getting it wrong. So I just stay on the sidelines. I don't engage. Maybe I'm afraid of rumors or gossip, right? If I'm mentoring a junior woman, will people start talking? Maybe I have implicit bias, right? There's this research in psychology called the women are wonderful effect. You ask men, what do you think of women? by and large, they say nice things, but they're words like women are nice, women are kind, women are gentle. What you don't hear is the competence language and the leadership language that's likely to lead to me offering a developmental connection or sponsoring, mentoring. And then 2017, Me Too comes along and goes widespread. And you're looking at the research from Bloomberg and others showing about 60% of men post Me Too were saying, no, I'm sorry, I'm not mentoring women. That's just too dicey, too scary, too risky. A lot of false narratives, of course, about Me Too. I spend a lot of my time reminding men what Me Too is actually about. Women would love to come to work and not be assaulted or harassed, super low bar for dudes to get over. But instead of that, you hear the narratives that women are scary, they're dangerous, can't meet alone with them. And I think all of us have an obligation to push back on that, but especially men. As a psychologist, I would just share with you that if you have anxiety about anything, including women, there's only one treatment for it. It's called exposure therapy. So more engagement, more conversation, more lunches, more coffee. That's really the only way you treat your anxiety. And let's not make it her problem that you're anxious. I think men need to take responsibility for that. Here's a final narrative. If you're a woman on the call today and you wonder what are the reasons men don't engage with you as much in the workplace, in close relationships, here's something men will share in private. I would mentor junior women, but what if she was attractive? Wouldn't that be awkward? Well, not so much, I don't think. And I have a huge medical breakthrough actually for those men. If you do hear this narrative, it's cutting edge. It's fMRI research, but I'm going to go ahead and share it because you're a medical audience. It turns out men have a frontal lobe, and the beauty of this, I can be aware somebody's attractive and have judgment and impulse control and good decision making. I share this with some intended humor, but I think there's a kernel of truth here. There's one more stream I think many of you will appreciate from social psychology on perceived mutual attraction. So go into a workplace like yours and have you anonymously rate to what extent do you find everybody you work with attractive. And then there's another column where you get to rate, well, to what extent do I think each of those people might be attracted to me? And it's interesting when you look at this research, one gender consistently inflates to what extent other people are attracted to them. And I'm guessing you know which one. So message for us men, she's not that into you. So let's keep it professional. If you're wondering about allyship, I want to give you kind of, this is my one slide takeaway from all the research I have done on allyship in the workplace. When you ask women, what are those micro behaviors you really appreciate, especially from men who show up as allies? It tends to fall into three big buckets. Number one, the interpersonal. How do you show up interpersonally in your relationships and hold yourself accountable? Number two, the public. And by the way, number one, interpersonal, that's the easy part of allyship because I only have to worry about myself. Public gets a lot harder. You ask men about this stuff, it makes them nervous because now I have to be out there publicly. I have to put some skin in the game. I have to disrupt bias in real time. I have to loudly advocate for women. This is where it gets a little more challenging. And then systemic. Boy, now I'm holding my organization accountable. Now I'm asking, why do we do things this way? I'm asking about policies, procedures, inequities, and I'm looking for those as a systemic ally. I want to just share with you that in the research that we do, the intersections matter. And I think that I frame really, really wonderful gender allyship as a wonderful gateway to allyship for other underrepresented groups because many of these skills are identical. They map nicely to other people who have less access and privilege. Here's some research from the McKinsey Women in the Workplace studies in the last couple of years, looking specifically at the experiences of women of color in the workplace. And I think the big takeaway, Black women, women of color, have very different experiences than their white female colleagues. And I've got to recognize women are not a monolith. They experience the workplace differently. And so as an ally, here's a great opportunity for some cultural humility. This is important. And, if we had time today and we were doing a workshop, I might ask you, what's your sense of why men do this work? Men who do show up as allies, men who seem to really get it. Why do they do it? What's their motivation? Here are the big things that we hear from men. Number one, the personal. There are women that I care about. There are women in my family. There are women that I've learned from, maybe a mentor that I've had who was a woman who really changed my perspective and made me aware. So the personal, I shared with you all the data. Some men are driven by the business case. Show me the bottom line. Why is it good for us to hire more women or get more women promoted? And then for some men, it's just part of their leadership brand, right? This is just who I am. There's a moral case to this. It's the right thing to do. It involves dignity and respect and inclusion. So this is how I identify as a leader. I think for a lot of men, there are mixed motivations, and I think we need to be ready to share those. So humorously, I would just tell you, I do a lot of workshops with men on better allyship. And it's often at this moment in the conversation that men are fired up. They're ready to throw on their allyship cape and head off into the workplace maybe at Mount Sinai. And we have to say, hold up there, gentlemen. Allyship has got to begin here. And let me give you some context for this. Here we are, the year 2023, lots of research on dual career, heterosexual couples, both working full-time. The evidence shows she is doing double, if not more, of the amount of domestic work, childcare, everything that goes into running the home. And this is not just doing the dishes. This is all the hidden cognitive emotional labor, right? Keeping lists, planning events, you name it, things that tend to default to women. One thing has got to be crystal clear. Until men start sharing fully domestically, sharing fully in caregiving, we're never going to get to gender equity in the workplace. This is where allyship has got to begin. If you happen to be a male, I always challenge you, go home tonight and do what I call a domestic audit, meaning, and especially if you're partnered with a woman, ask her, am I really pulling my weight? Am I really sharing fully in everything required to run our lives? If you're not doing this, I think it's a huge missed opportunity to get better. It's very incongruent to show up as an ally at work when you're not an ally at home. And so I think this is where it has to begin. Here's another element that I think gets us to mentoring related to this. Are you somebody as a mentor, as an ally, as a colleague who normalizes caregiving? Do you share your own caregiving obligations? When you have something that you have to do to take care of something with a family member, do you leave loudly? Meaning you don't slink out the back door, you normalize it by saying, hey, I won't be here today. I'm going to miss that meeting because I have a thing with my child that really is important and I need to share. If you do that, you just tend to find that you normalize it, not only for women who have been carrying this kind of burden alone for a long time, but for junior men who want to have more opportunity to engage as partners and as parents outside of work. Here's a final element before we get into some tactics, some best practices for allyship. This is not what allyship looks like. I got to tell you, I see too much of this. Men getting together, deciding what they're going to do for women. Maybe you've seen this before. I find it really unhelpful. It quickly devolves into rescuing. What are we going to do for women? This is a very different message than collaboration, becoming a co-conspirator, becoming a partner with women you work with, and asking the question, how are we going to go there together? What role can I play? As a majority male with some privilege, how would that look if I was really partnering with you? So with that, I'm just going to share some best tactics, both from the interpersonal, from our research, and also from the public, give you some best of, and then I'm really looking forward to our conversation together. So here, number one, this is where it begins. My colleague and I call this GQ, gender intelligence. Are you self-educating? You cannot put it on women to educate you about gender inequities in the workplace. There's so much written, there's so many great podcasts, so many things you can do to beef up your awareness of how women experience the workplace. And then after you do that work, go to some women that you have trust with, that you've hopefully curated trust with, and ask them, hey, I've been reading this, or I was just at this event we hosted at Sinai on Allyship. I'm really curious, is some of this going on here? Is some of this been part of your experience? And do what I call the ask to ask. Would it be okay if I asked you about some of your gendered headwinds here, things that I might miss? And if you're willing to share, I'd really love to learn and become more aware of what women on our team are actually experiencing. And remember, women are not a monolith again. Women have very different experiences, so get multiple data points. I think this is where great allyship begins. Here's a way one of the men that we interviewed actually kind of framed this, really kind of framing it in terms of his curiosity, genuine interest, awareness that he doesn't know a lot, maybe about the experiences of his female colleagues. And I think showing up this way is the right way to show up, no matter what the underrepresented group is. This is really crucial. Do you seek feedback? Are you open to feedback? When you step in it and get it wrong and have those light bulb moments, do you share it and say, wow, I just learned this today because I made a huge mistake. And I just want to share it with everybody on the team because you may not know this either. I'm really going to try and be better in this area, but boy, I needed that feedback and I really appreciate it. I don't see a lot of people doing that. I see people getting defensive when they get feedback, and that's a recipe for not getting any more of it. Let me just share personally a mistake my co-author and I made way back when we first started writing. Our first book was on cross-gender mentoring and especially how men could be better. Our working title for the book was Guiding Athena. And I'm just going to let that sit with you for a minute. How does that land? We thought it was a brilliant title, right? Guiding is a synonym for mentoring. Athena is this aspirational term for all the women that we work with in the military. Well, our publisher came to us like a month before publication and said, and it was a woman, and she said, hey, guys, can we talk about this title? Have you thought about how that might land with women? That they don't want to be told they need to be guided by a couple of guys. And we're like, oh, no, I didn't think about that. Huge, save, right? She saved us from a disaster. And we got a much better title out of it, right? Athena Rising, much more aspirational, but it gets away from a lot of that bias and stereotypical men telling women what to do stuff that I think we were missing. So I don't know if this one will shock any of you. In all of our interviews with women, listening always bubbled to the top of the list. And I think, to be honest with you, I had no idea how bad men were with this because so many men said, men will only listen to me long enough to fix me or fix my problem, but they don't listen generously. They're not good sounding boards. So here's a way that I can get better right off the bat. Can I make a commitment to doing this kind of spacious listening? Another big one is assumptions. We got to interview Janet Petro, who runs the Kennedy Space Center, and she said, my mentor was amazing. You really should get an interview with him. And we did. He was running the NASA at the time, Robert Lightfoot. We got an interview with him. He was very humble. And he said, gentlemen, let me tell you where I got it wrong. Mentoring women early in my career, I would make assumptions about them simply based on their gender. And I got off track. He said, here's an example. I was on a key committee for a key search position at NASA. In our last meeting, it became clear our top candidate was a woman by a mile. And I wanted to show how gender savvy I was. So I said, this job involves a lot of travel. And she just had a baby. I don't know. And he said, fortunately, a woman was sitting across from me with daggers coming from her eyes. And she said, Robert, I think she knows the job involves travel. I'm certain she knows she had a baby. So how about if she's our candidate, you don't decide for her? And he said that was such a light bulb moment. As a male, I thought I was being so helpful. I was missing it. And I had to learn to check my own assumptions. we've mentioned the feedback. I think these are some responses. If you're good with this, when you get feedback about how you're coming across, that are going to guarantee that you get more of that. And this is what really makes us allies. This is what makes us better. We welcome the feedback and then we put it into practice. Unfortunately, in the interviews that we did, way too many women shared with us that this happens to them. So there's some egregious sexism or bias or verbal harassment. She shares it with a male colleague. First thing out of his mouth is one of these statements, right? And whether he intends it or not, they serve to make her question her perception, her reality, maybe believe she's blowing it out of proportion. Very different than simply starting with, I believe you. Could you tell me more about what happened? And then, I know you don't need me to rescue you, but how could I collaborate so this does not continue to be part of your experience here? Really a different approach. You know, one of our chapters in the book on allyship came from a woman that we interviewed. She called meetings Fight Club for Women. And my takeaway from that was men often do not understand how in your typical meeting, women encounter all kinds of bias and headwinds. And it can be anything from who even got invited to the meeting, who's getting a seat at the table, who's getting time to speak, who's getting interrupted 3 times more than everybody else, and who's having her ideas valued and who's having her ideas dismissed and then maybe stolen by somebody else. I have to say, I was shocked in the interviews we did that so many women would share. They would have this great idea. They'd put it out there to their team. They'd get a muted reception. 15 minutes later, some guy says almost the same thing she did. And everyone's like, wow, now that's a promising idea. And I have to say, I had just never experienced that before, but women do. And in fact, they have language for it that we heard in our interviews. Women that we talked to call this broappropriation or heap eating or imitating. And that just tells you how prevalent this is. As an ally, once I become aware of this, now I have some thoughts or options in terms of how to do the disruption. You know, it can be as simple something as simple as, hey, Bob, that was a great idea, but I'm curious, how is that different than what Sandra said, 20 minutes earlier? I'm a little confused. Or I can simply attach the idea to her name right when she offers it. A lot of ways to mitigate this, but I think you have to be looking. Mentoring turned out to be huge for the women that we interviewed. One thing is clear based on that slide I showed you about the pipeline in medicine. Women in medicine can't just drop by the female mentor shop. It's not that easy. Because there are few women as you move up the chain of command, there are fewer senior women that I can go to for mentoring. So men have got to lean in here. If you expect your senior female leaders to do all the mentoring of your high talent junior women, it's not fair. It's a recipe for burnout. Those women won't be as productive. They'll be doing all this unpaid mentoring labor. So men have got to lean in here. The question is, how do you do that? One thing that came loud and clear from our research, women are not looking for this kind of hierarchical, top-down, tell me how to do my career. Really aversive, frankly, versus something that we think of as much more reciprocal, much more collaborative, something that celebrates mutual learning, kind of going both directions here. So I think that the way that you show up in cross-gender mentoring connections really matters. The other thing great mentors did was not get jealous. Not only do I not get jealous if I find out you have another mentor besides me, I'm actually connecting you to those other mentors, because I know the research. If you have more mentors, more sponsors, more colleagues in your corner, you're going to go farther. You're going to make more money. That robust mentoring constellation leads to better career outcomes. So let me be your great connector. As we have conversations, I'm always thinking, who else could I introduce you to broaden your constellation? Here's something I love from social psychology, and I just want to commend it to you in your developmental work, allyship, mentorship especially. This is a stream of research based on the construct of Michelangelo. So apparently, Michelangelo as a sculptor was notoriously humble. And when a sculpture emerged from the stone, like David or Moses or Madonna, he would say, wow, I was just as surprised as everybody else. I had no idea what was in there. I see my job as a sculptor as removing all the detritus on the outside so this ideal form can emerge. I approach my work with that kind of humility. It turns out, pulling this into the current day, the great couples do this for each other. Great partners in romantic relationships do this kind of humble sculpting. I'm listening to my partner's career dream. I'm listening to what her ideal self or their ideal self sounds like. And then I'm looking for ways to affirm it and then allow my partner to actually enact that. I think the wonderful mentors do this as well. I don't have preconceptions about where you want to go in your career or what your medical trajectory might look like. I want to do the discernment because once I do this, and this takes some commitment and time, now I have an idea what doors to open for you and how to be really effective. I think we need to address this. I have mixed feelings about this topic, and maybe in the Q&A this will come up, but I see a lot of women's leader development programs really focus on imposter syndrome. I'm not a fan of that term. It sounds like you have a clinical disorder, when we call it that. But do women get imposter feelings? Yes. And I think often that comes from a male-dominated workplace when they're getting messages that they don't belong or they don't fit in or they're a unicorn. We've never seen one of you in this specialty before. And so as a mentor and a colleague, yes, I recognize women get more of these imposter messages. So I better be ready to mitigate this. And an easy way to do it is just really copious affirmation, pushing back on self-doubt or embedded in internalized messages that maybe she doesn't belong in this thing, whatever it happens to be. Here's one more thing. I'll wrap up kind of the interpersonal with this, get onto some public. Devin, I wonder, could I use you for a minute just for a demo? So everybody who can see Devin and see her face, that's all we need to see here, Devin, is your face. Uh, Here's something that I hear from men. Yeah, I see these talented women, maybe at Sinai. I know that I should participate in sponsoring and mentoring more of them, but I'm just not sure how to make the offer, right? And I don't want it to be weird, so I don't offer. I just stay on the sidelines. I think we men make this harder than it has to be. So, Devin, can I just offer mentoring here? Would that be okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, let me try it this way, Devin, and just be authentic in responding. Devin, I'd like to mentor you. Yeah, I mean, so many so many problems with that. Number one, don't use your creepy voice, of course. But number two, poor Devin has no idea where this came from, right? This is just out of left field. She's wondering, what are you even talking about? Let me try it a different way here. Hey, Devin, I saw you give that talk last week, and I thought it was really excellent. I was just thinking to myself, wow, the hiring committee sure got it right bringing you on board. I hope we can keep you here. If you ever want to drop by and just talk about next career steps and how I can promote that, I've got an open door. Just feel free to drop by.
Wow, thanks so much. I will definitely be taking you up on that.
Yeah, thank you. And I think a lot of people would, right? I was able to sneak in a little affirmation. Friends, I have to just tell you, that's not a heavy lift. That took me 1 minute. And, now it's up to my junior colleague to decide whether to take me up on that or not. Okay, so now let's get into where it really gets hard. And I think this gets hard for all of us. But if we're talking about gender allyship, this is especially daunting for men, putting some skin in the game and actually disrupting in real time. And I am actually going to ask everybody who is willing on the call to help me demonstrate something in a moment. So be willing to unmute yourself if you're willing. You don't even have to be on camera if you don't want, but I am going to ask you to unmute yourself. Let me give you a little context here. You're in a meeting. And maybe you hear a guy say something like, why don't we have more senior women here at Sinai? And another guy immediately follows with, well, you know why that is. Women just don't want to work that hard. Boom, there it is, just dropped on the table. Everybody heard it. My question to you is, what would you do? And you can think about that for a moment while I share what the research shows. So bystander research shows nothing. Most of us do nothing, and then we regret it, right? We do the Monday morning quarterbacking later after the meeting and say, oh, I should have said something. I should have called that out, but I didn't. And the moment is lost, and everyone leaves the meeting feeling upset, or many of us do. So within 3 seconds, something called bystander paralysis sets in, and I think we have to mitigate that. So I have a 2-second rule. Within 2 seconds of an inappropriate comment landing, I have to be willing to disrupt. And if I'm not sure how to disrupt, I simply can use a disruptive technique, like, how about just saying, ouch? I love the ouch technique because it's kind of awkward, and it's going to buy me a few more seconds to see, what I'm going to follow that up with. So I was just looking through the list of people on the call, and I'm not seeing any men, which is really disappointing to me. But I was going to have a male participate in a dude conversation, but I'm just looking at one other person. Joy, are you willing to help me with this? Okay, Joy. I'm going to have
by
you.
the way, there are some men. I see Hugh
Oh,
Sampson
there
and
are.
Paul Stelzer.
Oh,
Too.
oh, okay. Well, I'll tell you what. Just in the interest of time, Joy, if you're willing to do it, can you just channel your inner dude? Because we're going to have a dude conversation just for a minute. And you don't have to do anything, but just agree with everything I say for the purpose of this. This will only take 20 seconds, but if everybody else could unmute, Joy and I are in a meeting. As you're walking in, we're having a sidebar conversation. If you hear something that doesn't land the right way with us, would all of you yell ouch loudly? This should be very disruptive. I'd really like to hear some disruption during this conversation. This is only going to go 20 seconds, but I think there might be some disruptive opportunity.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, Joy, look at that. She's totally channeling her dude. Okay. Okay. So Joy, I was in that meeting the other day, and that new person you hired, Shonda, gave such a great talk. Wow, she is amazing. I was just thinking, if you're mentoring her, I know she's in your department, it would be nice if she smiled more, when she's speaking.
Ouch. Ouch.
Because otherwise
but I've been trying so hard to mentor her. I've been telling her exactly what she should be doing.
There you go. Oh, good. Yes, you should mansplain to her. I was thinking, Joy, someone that talented, I'd like to get over on my side. Now, there's a lot of international travel. Is she married? Do you know?
You know what? Travel's out. Got to be out.
Travels. Okay. Well,
and you can't get her on your side because she's mine.
One last.
Ouch.
Joy, I'm afraid how good you are with this. One last thing,
that's because
Joy.
I've experienced it, man.
Yes. One last thing, Joy. Hey, between you and me, she is easy on the eyes, right?
Ouch. Oh,
okay.
Yes.
Boom. Okay. Thank you, Joy. I think you were born for that role. That was excellent.
I don't want that role.
I think what all of you just showed is how easy it is to disrupt. And I think you showed also that these two people could not have continued that conversation. Now, here's the really important part. After the disruption, I hear too many men say, hey, brother, there are women in the room. You can't talk that way. No, that's not allyship. You need to be ready to own it. And here are some own it statements I like. These can be as simple as, we don't do that here. I didn't find that funny. That sounds like an old gender stereotype. But make clear that your discomfort is because you were offended, not the underrepresented person in the room. So own it, I think, really important. This one is crucial, and I want to share an academic medicine example with you here. This is about pushing back on secrecy. One of the women that we interviewed had just shared a vice dean job at a major medical school, and she had been hired at the same time as a male. They had produced the same academic record, same teaching evaluations, and then shared a vice dean job for 5 years and produced absolutely shared outcomes. And at the end of that, the dean of the entire school wanted to meet with them individually as they went back to the faculty to renegotiate their salaries. Well, her male colleague found out when her meeting with the dean was and came directly to her office after his meeting. He scheduled his before hers, and he handed her a piece of paper. And he said, Hideko, I want you to see this number because I have a feeling that as a woman, you're going to get lowballed when you go in and meet with a dean. And this is what he offered me. If he offers you more, great, but I don't want you to get lowballed. It wouldn't be fair. She went in the next day and got offered something like 12,000 less, of course, than her male colleague. And she was immediately able to show the number. He blinked and raised her salary to that number. For me, that was an example of public allyship, pushing back on secrecy, refusing to allow that to take hold and create inequity. When you look at pay gaps, this is a big piece of why we have those. Decentering, another wonderful ally technique. You know, if I go into a meeting as an older white male, people often look at me and just assume I'm going to start the meeting, even if I'm not the subject matter expert, which is often the case. And so a lot of the folks that we talked to said, a great technique here is just decentering, right? Everyone's going to look at you. You've got that privilege. Can you just hand somebody else the mic in that moment? You know, I'd love to share my 2 cents, but, you know, Joy is really the subject matter expert here, and I'd love to hear her thoughts because I've learned a lot from her on this topic, and I think she should be the one leading this meeting. Very easy thing to do, not hard, but it gets the person in the spotlight who should be there. So let's talk about sponsorship. You know, I mentioned the research showing women get a lot of the nice mentoring without the sponsoring. And we got to interview Sheryl Sandberg at Facebook around this topic. And her number one takeaway for men especially was, hey, if you're mentoring a woman, stop being just nice to her. You need to be her sponsor. You need to be pushing her forward. This was her experience. She shared her first job out of college was as a primary assistant to the Secretary of the U.S. Treasury. Everywhere they went on the world stage, he would introduce her to each new person for about 2 minutes, and he would rave about her. He would say, hey, this is Sheryl Sandberg. She's a rock star, graduated #1 in economics from Harvard. I couldn't do my job without her. She's amazing. He would go on, and she pulled him aside and said, Larry, stop. That's embarrassing. And he said, Sheryl, this is how your career launches. You've got to let me do this for you. This is sponsoring. If people know what I think of you, they're going to want you to work for them too. So litmus tests for, I think, a lot of us who aspire to be better allies. Are you talking about her when she's not in the room? If you're not, what a huge missed opportunity when there are conversations about promotions, next opportunities for advancement. I think great sponsors are doing this. And let's also just acknowledge the research that women can be socialized not to put their hand in the air for opportunities, for promotions, for advancement. You know, people who look like me get socialized to raise their hand when they only meet half the criteria. Yeah, I'm ready for that. We tend to promote men on potential, while women are always having to prove it again, right? Over and over again. So knowing that, if I have, you know, a new position and there are 8 criteria and I've got all these men applying who only meet 4, and I've got these women on my team who meet 7.5, but they're not putting their name in. Rather than just accept that status quo, why wouldn't you go to her and have a conversation? Hey, I see you as ready for this, and yet you're not putting your name in. Could I find out why? Maybe you have a good reason, and I want to be respectful of that. But if it's just that you don't see yourself as ready, wow, what an opportunity for a great mentoring, sponsoring conversation. You know, let's talk about this delta and how you see yourself and I see you. And would you let me push you forward? And I'm not going to push you forward in isolation, make it a glass cliff. I'm going to give you the resources and support you need to be successful once you get into that stretch assignment. Going to wrap up here in a moment, but let's talk about one systemic element of allyship, the whole issue of leadership. there is so much evidence now that men have a lot of leeway in how we lead, right? I can be very democratic. I can be more authoritative, and people still rate me as positive in my leadership behavior. Women, not so much, often walking a tightrope. If you're more traditionally feminine, whatever that means, democratic, inclusive, you're likely to get rated less effective. If you are more traditionally masculine, agentic, more top-down directive, you get labeled your favorite B word, right? And so it can feel like you're walking a tightrope often. Here's some brand new research that I don't know if any of you are going to resonate with, but this just came out last year called the Tallest Poppy Study. And it was looking at women who self-identify as very ambitious, right? And these are women who are rocking it in their workplace and their profession. They're high performers, and they're out there saying, yes, I want to be the CEO, or I want to be the dean of this medical school. What happens to those women? Well, by and large, they get undermined, they get sabotaged. And it's a lot by men. Men who are in leadership find ambitious women violating the stereotype that women shouldn't be ambitious, and so they get pushback. As an ally, I've got to be aware of this research. I've got to find ways to support women in leadership. I've got to be that active sponsor. I've got to be pushing people forward, but also mitigating, pushing back when I hear these biased comments about women who have made it. If you wonder where this leadership thing actually factors in to why we're not advancing women into leadership, here's one big area. This is a huge study on subjective evaluations based on gender. And, you know, for leaders, subjectivity in evaluations is where bias starts to really trickle into career outcomes. So this was a huge study of 80,000 subjective evaluations of both men and women. And what you see here is the language that gets applied to both genders is different. Women get a lot more negative language, but even positive, you know, women more likely to be called compassionate, men analytical. If you only have one job opening, who are you going to hire, right? Well, I'll tell you, it's most often the analytical person. Recent study out of Stanford shows that this is why we get more men promoting who aren't as competent, and why we have a gender pay gap. So as an ally, I want to ask about this, you know, subjective evaluations. Are we doing it in a way that breeds bias? Should we be doing it in a different way? And then the accountability part in all our practices, all our procedures. I don't know how many of you have been on a search committee where something like this has happened, this kind of language. It happens every day. And as an ally, I need to ask questions. What do you mean by likability? And how do we measure that? And what do you mean by fit? Does that just mean she doesn't look like everybody else on the team? And often that's what it means. But we have to notice it, number one, and then we have to be willing to push back. So I am going to stop at that point. I know I could talk all afternoon on allyship and gender in the workplace, but I'm not going to do that. I'd like to just hear what's on your mind for some great Q&A.
Thank you so much, Dr. Johnson. We did get a couple of questions in advance of the event, and I can start with some of those. We also have a question in the chat. And if anyone would like to come off mute to ask a question or put a question in the chat, you are more than welcome to. But I will start with the one in the chat, going back to some of the data that you talked about when you were interviewing men, and they had rumors about, or they felt awkward about mentoring junior women. Can you share if there are any data, if those rare women in high power leadership positions worry about rumors or feel awkward about mentoring junior men?
You know, yes, there's some of that. It's a very good question, although it's not as pervasive as the fear that men seem to have. I will just say, you know, whether you're male or female or however you identify, I think in the year 2023, you have to be willing, if you're in any leadership role, to take meetings in private with anybody, and I don't care what their gender is. If you're not comfortable with a private closed door meeting with somebody on your team, I don't think you should be in a leadership job. We just don't have time for that. I mean, I hear this from men often. I wouldn't meet privately with women. Well, then for goodness sake, don't meet privately with men, right? Keep an even policy so nobody is disadvantaged. I wish that people could get over this with some exposure therapy, because it says something about your brand if you're not comfortable doing that. Let me talk about the gossip or rumor issue, though. It doesn't matter what your gender is. We interviewed a vice president of a company who said, we were bringing in a ton of talented women, and I realized I wasn't mentoring any of them. And then when I did a gut check about why, I realized I was doing almost all my mentoring over dinner and drinks after work. And he said, when I looked at that, I realized, of course, women may not feel comfortable with that optic. They don't want to be seen with a senior leader over drinks after work. And, women have more obligations at home because their partners aren't sharing fully. So he changed it. He made a breakfast, lunch only policy. And he said, now I do all of my mentoring only at breakfast or lunch. My assistant only schedules those time zones. And he said, within 5 years, I've gone to almost 50-50 just by making that one little shift. And so I do think the when and the where matter, and you need to be aware of that as a mentor. Make it transparent, make it public, don't hide it. I often tell men, if you only mentor one junior woman and that's it, and you spend an inordinate amount of time with her, that's weird. It looks creepy. But if you mentor lots of men and women, and it's just part of your brand, there's no rumors. People don't talk. They just know that's who you are. So I think the way that you do this, the way that you show up, it's not a heavy lift to make it both equitable and very transparent. And let's just not let there be any secrets on who we're mentoring.
We have another great question in the chat about where you think this education has the largest impact. Is it too late to try to teach senior men? Should we be focusing on educational efforts among trainees, medical students, residents?
Yeah, it's a great question. In a perfect world, I would say the answer is both. I wish that senior leaders were leading on this. And I don't want to throw anybody under the bus, but when I do sessions like this, senior male leaders don't show up. And I wish they would, because what a great opportunity to communicate to the whole environment, the entire team there, that this really matters to us, and it's important to our business and who we are. If you're not present at this moment, I think it also says something. I would love junior folks to absolutely get the message, but I think they also need the role modeling from people who are more senior. I mentioned that whole caregiving issue. If senior leaders are slinking out the back door when they have to take their kids somewhere, I think what a huge missed opportunity for role modeling this more broadly. So yeah, I think the answer is both. I think that senior men, we have to hold them accountable. And I hope junior employees are also getting the message and the good role modeling.
Sandy and then Joy.
I would just like to say about the senior men, we have a secret weapon that comes up very often, and that is, I have daughters, and I know what it feels like. And so I think there's an ally hidden in almost every parent, and one should attempt to reach that senior person that way. And also, I just want to share one little anecdote. My son does intellectual property litigation, and told his boss that he was leaving because he had to be at a school function that evening and for his son. And the boss said, well, okay, you're going to be babysitting. And he said, no, it's parenting. And he left that firm and joined one that was headed by two women.
Yeah. much more inviting. Yeah. And it's funny, Sandra, the daughters thing, I think that's true. That's often a way to get to motivation sometimes for more senior men. But I have seen men stand up in front of a big audience and say, hey, I'm an ally because I have daughters. And sometimes they get pushback when they do that, right? Women will say, really? You had to have a daughter to just get interested in equity and fairness. So I think we have to have some humility about that.
Joy, go ahead.
First of all, I want to thank the men who are on this Zoom. I see Nolan, I see Paul, I see Hugh, and I appreciate you're here. I wish more men of our colleagues were on this, because I think except for those guys who are on now, you're kind of preaching to the choir. You're preaching to the wrong people. And it's a little hard for us to give that message as women to other men. I think that many times I feel like when I am more outgoing in my demands or being assertive, I'm walking that tightrope you were explaining, and often being labeled the B word. And I wonder if you had any advice on how to be that more assertive person without getting the label.
Yeah, $1 million question, Joy. That it is great. I mean, I spend so much time trying to teach men to notice that and recognize it, and then, say something or intervene as an ally or show up as a partner. But I think that often for women, a terrific strategy is just to show up as allies for each other in those moments, because often, I mean, you may be in isolation sometimes when that happens. It may be just you, but very often things like this happen in environments where there are other people. So to be able to call out for one another, not only amplify your contributions and what they really appreciate about your leadership, but also to disrupt. So when a guy says something about your leadership style, like, wow, she's abrasive, to have other people in the room just ask a Socratic question, like, really, would you say that about a guy who said exactly the same thing? Those disruptive things that we can do for each other, it doesn't have to be just men who are allies. And I see a lot of women showing up as allies for each other in these moments. So having a team of people who are somewhat aware, and people you can debrief with, people you can pre-game meetings with, I think that's a great strategy. So you're not out there on your own. Part of the reason I say that, Joy, is there's a lot of research for women showing that when they call this stuff out themselves, they get blowback. And maybe you've experienced this. As a male, if I disrupt in a meeting, like do the ouch thing and then hold someone accountable, people say, wow, what a great leader. When you do it, you're more likely to pay a penalty, right? She's hard to work with. She's prickly, you name it. Those are common.
And those adjectives are often they're often given in secret afterwards. They're not given necessarily in the meeting where we can counter them.
Right.
Instead, we often get the interruption. I mean, that happens to me all the time.
Yeah.
And if I just keep talking while that other person's talking, it doesn't always solve the problem. But I have seen other women in the meeting just roll their eyes, which isn't enough.
Yes.
They're not standing up the way we want them to.
Yeah. So because this stuff happens after often, that's when I'd love to have somebody who gets it in the room when it does happen, who can say, tell me more about what you're saying about Joy, because that's not how I experience her. And I wonder if you can give me specific examples of what you mean by abrasive, because I think there might be a bias there, and I want to hold you accountable. If that's not happening, then it can feel very helpless when those maybe advancement or pay or promotion conversations happen and you're not there.
Thank you.
We have time. I mean, we're at time, but Kathy, I want you to be able to ask your question.
So I was just going to ask if you had any suggestions for the scenario you raised, which I think probably many of us have encountered, where you're evaluating either on a search committee, or many of us serve on thesis committees, and men are praised for their potential and women are raked over the coals for what they haven't accomplished. I have raised this many times, whether it's on search committees, thesis committees, and sometimes it goes well. And I don't accuse anyone. I just say, hey, there's this trope. Is this what's happening here? Can we take a pause and examine it? And sometimes, most of the time I get like, no, of course not. Wait, is it? But sometimes, as you were just saying about when you try to disrupt, I have been screamed at, and then multiple follow-up emails have been sent accusing me of bias.
Yeah.
So the blowback can be pretty extensive. So I'm just wondering if you had any advice as to how to be more effective to disrupt in those sorts of scenarios to have a better outcome and avoid that blowback.
You know, and I'm sorry that it's been part of your experience, Kathy. You're probably not alone with that. I mean, one thought I have is, again, back to part of what I was sharing with Joy is, can you make this a team sport? Meaning, when you're on these committees, is there at least one other person who gets it, so that you can kind of pregame and say, hey, how are we going to address this when it comes up? Because we've already seen it's come up in some other conversations. So when someone says, hey, I'm not sure she has what it takes, or, you know, I'd really like to see her demonstrate that she can do this job, even though, you know, she did it at another place and did it very competently, and the guy they're recommending has never done it, but we think he has great potential. How should we address that? And so having some colleagues in the room who are willing to kind of amplify this, you can take turns sort of calling these things out. I think that's helpful, so you're not in isolation. I think also the Socratic question, you know, so you're not making people defensive, but just say, really curious about this, because we've already recommended a couple of people who don't have nearly the experience she does. And so I'm curious how we're getting there and what criteria we're using. And can we all go back and do a calibration on how we're going to advance people or hire people? What are the criteria? And then now I can, if people agree on this, now I can hold people accountable when they start going off on, I'm not sure she has what it takes, or he's got great potential. No, let's go back to the criteria and let's not use those terms. Much like likability, right? Do we have an objective measure of likability we're using? If not, can we please not use that term here anymore, because it's very subjective and it leads to bias. But I think if you're the only in the room, Kathy, you know, maybe in this case, the only woman, it makes it a more precarious thing for you, because yeah, I think inevitably you're going to be labeled that person who's really sensitive about the gender issue. So more reason we need allies in the room with you.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Johnson. We are out of time. I just want to point to a comment from Sarah Miller in the chat about just looking at some of the literature around bias in the workplace toward non-binary or gender fluid people. And hopefully that can be a follow-up discussion that we have. But this was really great, a very engaged group. Thank you, everyone, for joining, and have a wonderful day. Dr. Johnson, we will see you on the other line for our small group chat. There's
okay.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.
Take care.